The Academy Incident. The morning alarm echoed through the crystalline corridors of Titan Military Academy, like the death cry of some ancient beast. Elena Vasquez rolled out of her narrow bunk with the fluid grace of someone who had been waking, up at dawn for most of her 19 years. Around her, alien cadets of every conceivable shape and size began their daily ritual of complaints, groans, and elaborate stretching routines that defied basic physics. Elena simply stood up, ran her fingers through her short black hair, and began her morning routine. No fanfare, no drama, just quiet efficiency that most of her classmates had learned to ignore completely. After 8 months at the academy, she had perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. The academy itself was a marvel of galactic engineering, built into the hollowed-out core of Kepler Station. Rotating sections provided artificial gravity that could be adjusted for different species, while specialized atmosphere processors ensured everyone could breathe comfortably. It was designed to be the ultimate training ground, where the galaxy's finest military minds could learn from each other. In practice, it was mostly a place where different species found new and creative ways to demonstrate their superiority over everyone else. Elena made her way to the communal washing facilities, nodding politely to the few cadets who bothered to acknowledge her existence. Most didn't. To them, she was just another human from that little backwater planet in the outer rim. Weak, soft, and probably only here because of some diversity quota the council had implemented. She preferred it that way. The main training hall was a cathedral of controlled violence. The ceiling stretched up into darkness, while the floor could shift between different terrains at the touch of a button. This morning, it was configured as a standard sparring arena, with observation decks rising in concentric circles around the central combat zone. Commander Thaxel stood at the center like a monument to military might. The Krillian was nearly 9 feet tall, his crystalline exoskeleton catching the light and throwing it back in sharp, threatening angles. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world where predators came in sizes that would make Earth's dinosaurs look like house pets. His forearms ended in hands that could crush steel, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had never been successfully challenged. "Today," he announced, his voice echoing off the walls, "we will demonstrate the fundamental differences between species bred for war and those less fortunate in their evolutionary development." Elena took her usual spot in the back, settling cross-legged on the floor with the casual flexibility that came from a childhood spent in Earth's enhanced gravity training programs. Around her, the other cadets arranged themselves according to the complex social hierarchy that governed military academies throughout the galaxy. At the front sat the elite cadets. Zeph, the Veltar noble, stretched his forearms in a display of coordinated movement that never failed to impress instructors. His purple skin seemed to shimmer with health and genetic perfection, and his family's wealth had bought him the finest combat training credits could purchase. Behind him clustered the heavy worlders, massive beings from planets where gravity pulled 3 times harder than galactic standard. Their every movement spoke of contained power and barely controlled aggression. In the middle section sat the technical specialists and support cadets, the engineers, medics, and communications, experts who kept armies functioning. Cora, the gentle Hytherian, caught Elena's eye and offered a small smile. Her tentacled appendages moved in the fluid patterns that her species used for emotional communication, conveying friendship and concern. And in the back, almost forgotten, sat the handful of cadets from species considered developmental, worlds that were new to galactic civilization or whose inhabitants were deemed physically inferior for military service. Elena was the only human. "Combat," Commander Thaxel continued, beginning his slow pace around the arena, "is ultimately about the application of superior force, speed, strength, endurance. These are the qualities that determine victory or defeat. No amount of tactical thinking can overcome fundamental physical limitations." He gestured to one of the heavy worlders, a massive Gorvanian whose rocky hide could deflect small arms fire. "Cadet Thrum, demonstrate the crushing mountain technique." Thrum rose with movements like tectonic plates shifting. He approached a training dummy designed to simulate average galactic physiology and proceeded to reduce it to component atoms, with a series of blows that made the entire floor vibrate. Excellent, Thaxel nodded. Notice the efficiency. No wasted motion, no unnecessary complexity. Pure, overwhelming force applied with precision. A few seats away from Elena, she heard one of the mid-tier cadets whisper, "Bet the human couldn't dent that thing with a plasma cutter." Elena didn't react. She had learned long ago that responding to every slight only encouraged more of them. Besides, she was genuinely interested in Thrum's technique. The Gorvanian had excellent form, though his strikes telegraphed slightly too. The left due to an old injury she had noticed weeks ago. Who can tell me, Thaxel asked the class, why certain species should focus on support roles rather than direct combat? Zeph's hand shot up with the eagerness of someone who lived for moments like this. Sir, species from low-gravity worlds lack the bone density and muscle mass necessary for effective combat. Their reaction times are adequate for technical work, but they simply cannot compete with properly evolved warriors. Precisely, Thaxel smiled, showing teeth that had evolved for tearing through armor plating. There is no shame in knowing one's limitations. A wise commander uses each species according to their natural capabilities. Elena absently cracked her knuckles, a habit she had picked up during her years in the Australian Enhanced Training Program. The sound was barely audible, but somehow it carried in the sudden quiet of the arena. Perhaps, Thaxel said, his faceted eyes fixing on her with laser focus. Our human cadet would like to share her thoughts on natural limitations. The arena went dead silent. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward Elena, representing every major species in the Galactic Alliance. Some showed curiosity, others barely concealed amusement, and a few displayed the kind of predatory interest that suggested they were already planning how to use this moment for their own social advancement. Elena looked up from her comfortable position on the floor. "Oh, sorry, sir. Were you asking me something?" A ripple of surprised laughter ran through the assembly. Apparently, addressing Commander Thaxel with such casual indifference was not standard protocol. Thaxel's crystalline plates shifted color, slightly, cycling toward the deeper blues that indicated irritation among his people. "I was inviting you to comment on the role of physical limitations in military effectiveness." "Ah," Elena nodded, as if this were the most natural conversation in the world. "Well, I suppose limitations are mostly about perspective, aren't they? Are they?" Thaxel's voice carried that particular tone instructors used when they were about to make an example of someone. "Perhaps you would care to elaborate with a practical demonstration?" Elena tilted her head slightly. "What kind of demonstration? A simple sparring exercise. Nothing too strenuous, we wouldn't want you to injure yourself." The condescension in his voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. Around the arena, cadets began to lean forward in anticipation. This was exactly the kind of entertainment that made academy life bearable. Elena glanced around the suddenly expectant faces, then back at Thaxel. "If you insist, sir." She stood up with the same casual grace she brought to everything else. At 5 feet, 6 inches tall, and maybe 140 pounds, she looked like a child among the giants surrounding her. Her academy uniform hung loose on her small frame, and her movements carried none of the aggressive posturing that characterized career warriors. "Excellent," Thaxel gestured toward the center of the arena. "Cadet Zeph, perhaps you would assist with this demonstration?" Zeph practically glowed with excitement as he rose from his front row position. This was his moment, a chance to demonstrate Veltar superiority in front of the entire academy, while simultaneously putting an inferior species in its place. The two cadets faced each other in the center of the arena. The contrast was almost comical. Zeph stood nearly 7 feet tall, his 4 muscular arms ending in hands that had been genetically enhanced for combat. His purple skin seemed to ripple with barely contained energy, and his movements carried the fluid precision of someone who had been trained in warfare since childhood. Elena stood quietly across from him, hands at her sides, looking for all the world like she was waiting for a bus rather than preparing for combat. "Standard academy rules," Thaxel announced. "Non-lethal contact only. First to yield or leave the combat zone loses. Begin when ready." Zeph immediately dropped into a combat stance that showed off all four arms to maximum advantage. His training was obvious in every line of his body. Expensive, comprehensive, and designed to intimidate as much as destroy. Elena didn't move. "Aren't you going to assume a fighting position?" Zeph asked, his voice carrying just enough concern to sound magnanimous while making it clear he considered this a joke. "I'm good," Elena replied. Zeph shrugged and began his attack. His species was known for their multi-limbed fighting style, and he executed it flawlessly. Four arms moved in coordinated patterns, creating overlapping zones of attack that should have been impossible to defend against. Elena stepped sideways. Not a dodge, not a block, not a counterattack. Just a simple step to her left that somehow placed her completely outside Zeph's striking range while barely seeming to move at all. Zeph frowned and tried again, this time with a more aggressive combination that utilized his reach advantage. His instructors had always praised his ability to control distance and timing. Elena stepped sideways again, and again, and again. For 30 seconds, Zeph threw everything he had at her, while Elena simply moved. Not frantically, not desperately, just small, efficient adjustments that made every attack miss by inches. She looked almost bored. "Stop playing with me," Zeph snarled, abandoning technique for raw aggression. He lunged forward with all four arms extended, trying to simply overwhelm her with mass and momentum. Elena's hand moved. It wasn't fast enough to be invisible. Everyone in the arena could see exactly what happened. She simply reached out, caught Zeph's leading wrist, and twisted. The sound of breaking bone echoed through the arena like a gunshot. Zeph's scream of pain and shock was almost drowned out by the collective gasp from 200 watching cadets. The proud Veltar noble collapsed to his knees, cradling his mangled arm while staring at Elena in complete bewilderment. Elena looked down at him with the same mild expression she wore, in mourning formation. "You okay?" That sounded like it hurt. "What?" Zeph gasped through his pain. "What did you do?" "Spiral fracture of the radius and ulna," Elena said matter-of-factly. "Clean break. Should heal fine with proper medical attention. Cora?" She looked toward the Hytherian medic. "Could you take a look at him?" Cora was already moving, her tentacles flowing over Zeph's injured arm with practiced skill. "Definitely broken," she confirmed. "But Elena's right. It's a clean break. He'll be fine in a few days with regenerative therapy." The arena remained dead silent except for Zeph's labored breathing. Elena looked around at the sea of shocked faces, then up at Commander Thaxel. "Was there anything else, sir? It's almost time for morning nutrition period." Thaxel's crystalline plates had shifted through several color spectrums during the brief combat. Now they seemed stuck somewhere between confused green and alarmed yellow. "How did you—" "That should have been impossible," Elena shrugged. I mean, Zeph's got great form and all, but he telegraphs to the left when he's committing to an attack, probably from favoring an old shoulder injury. And he drops his guard on the right side when he extends with his upper arms. Basic leverage. Did the rest? Basic leverage? Thaxel's voice climbed an octave. Physics is pretty universal, right? Elena seemed genuinely puzzled by his confusion. Force times distance equals work, conservation of momentum, that kind of thing. Plus, I've been training in 3G since I was 5, so the movements here feel kind of slow. She said it like she was asking a question, as if she couldn't understand why everyone was staring at her. 3 times galactic gravity? Someone whispered from the crowd. Standard for Australian. Enhanced training program, Elena confirmed. Most Earth military programs run at least double G for basic conditioning. Australia just cranks it up a bit more because, well, everything there tries to kill you anyway, so might as well make it interesting. Commander Thaxel was beginning to understand that he had made a very serious miscalculation. Cadet Vasquez, perhaps you could join me in my office after classes today. We need to discuss your background in more detail. Sure thing, sir. Should I bring my training records? Fair warning, though, they're pretty boring. Lots of running, climbing, dodging various venomous creatures, that sort of thing. As Elena walked back to her seat, the other cadets parted before her like she was carrying a contagious disease. The casual way she had dismantled Zeph, without apparent effort or even interest, had fundamentally changed how every person in that arena thought about humans. Elena settled back into her cross-legged position and checked her chronometer. Still 15 minutes until nutrition period. Maybe she could finish the quantum mechanics assignment that was due next week. Behind her, she could hear whispered conversations starting up as the shock began to wear off. Words like death world and gravity adaptation and why didn't anyone tell us floated through the air. Elena smiled slightly to herself. Maybe now they'd stop assuming she was weak just because she was quiet. After all, back home on Earth, the quiet ones were usually the most dangerous. The real test, the emergency. Klaxon cut through the Academy's normal routine like a plasma cutter through tissue paper. Elena looked up from her advanced tactics textbook as red lights began flashing throughout the study hall. Around her, cadets from a dozen different species began the complex dance of emergency protocol, some reaching for equipment, others checking communication devices, and a few just standing around looking confused. Captain Morrison's voice crackled over the intercom system with the kind of grim authority that made everyone stop what they were doing and pay attention. All senior cadets report to Briefing Bay 7 immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. Elena closed her book and stood up with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything else. 3 days had passed since the Yaoyai incident with Zeph, and she was still adjusting to being the center of attention wherever she went. Cadets who had never bothered to learn her name now watched her every movement with a mixture of fascination and wariness. She preferred the old anonymity, honestly. Briefing Bay 7 was chaos when she arrived. 200 senior cadets from every species and specialization were cramming into a space designed for half that number. The air recycling system struggled to accommodate the different atmospheric requirements, creating a hazy mix that smelled like ozone and nervousness. Commander Thaxel stood at the central podium, but it was Captain Morrison who commanded the room's attention. The gruff human instructor looked like he had been carved from the same asteroid as the Academy itself, all hard angles and contained violence. His gray hair was military short, and his scarred hands told stories of battles Elena could only imagine. "Listen up, people." Morrison's voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "We've got a real situation developing in the Kepler Nebula. Nexari raiders have attacked the mining colony on Theta 7. Initial reports suggest they're not just hitting and running, they're trying to establish a permanent foothold." The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Everyone knew about the Nexari. They were the boogeyman that kept civilized species awake at night, a hive-mind collective that consumed entire worlds and converted the populations into more of themselves. They hadn't been seen in this sector for over 50 years. "The good news," Morrison continued, "is that the Third Fleet is en route and should arrive within 18 hours. The bad news is that the colonists might not have 18 hours. Long range. Sensors show Nexari bioships beginning terraforming operations." Elena felt a familiar cold sensation in her stomach. She had read the reports about Nexari terraforming. It involved converting all organic matter on a planet into raw material for their ships. The colonists weren't just facing conquest. They were facing consumption. Commander Thaxel took over the briefing. "Under normal circumstances, we would wait for fleet assets to handle this situation. However, the Academy's position makes us the closest military response available. Therefore, senior cadets will be deployed in support roles for a reconnaissance mission." The excitement in the room was palpable. Most of these cadets had been training for years without seeing real combat. This was their chance to prove themselves, against actual enemies instead of training simulations. Elena wasn't excited. She was calculating. "Cadet teams will be assigned based on specialization and species compatibility," Thaxel continued. "Remember, this is a reconnaissance mission. Your job is to gather intelligence and evacuate civilians, not to engage in direct combat with Nexari forces." Elena almost laughed at that. Clearly, Thaxel had never met the Nexari personally. They didn't really do non-combat situations. The team assignments were posted on the main display, and Elena found herself grouped with an interesting mix of cadets. Cora, the Hytherian medic, offered her a tentacled greeting that conveyed both friendship and concern. Marcus, a heavy worlder from the Titan colonies, nodded respectfully. Apparently, her demonstration against Zeph had earned her some credibility with the strength-focused species. The surprise was Rex, a Veltar technical specialist who happened to be Zeph's younger brother. He approached her with obvious nervousness, all four arms fidgeting with his equipment pack. "Cadet Vasquez?" His voice carried the same aristocratic accent as his brother, but without the arrogance. "I wanted to apologize for Zeph's behavior the other day. He's always been competitive." Elena shrugged. "No harm done. How's his arm?" "Fully healed," Rex replied, then added quietly, "He asked me to tell you that he'd like to learn some of your techniques when this is over. If you'd be willing to teach him." That was unexpected. Elena had figured the proud Veltar would want nothing to do with her after being publicly humiliated. "Sure," she said, always happy to share. Their transport ship was a modified courier vessel called the Swift Current. It had been designed for speed rather than comfort, with acceleration couches that could theoretically protect passengers during emergency maneuvers that would turn most biological beings into paste. Elena strapped herself in next to Cora and checked her equipment one more time. Standard Academy loadout: emergency atmosphere suit, basic communication gear, medical supplies, and a plasma sidearm that she sincerely hoped she wouldn't need to use. The journey to Theta 7 took 4 hours, during which Elena tried to ignore the increasingly nervous chatter from her teammates. Marcus kept checking and rechecking his heavy combat gear, while Rex ran continuous diagnostics on his sensor equipment. Even Cora seemed agitated, her tentacles moving in patterns that Elena had learned indicated deep concern. Elena spent the time reviewing everything she knew about Nexari combat tactics. They were efficient, ruthless, and completely without mercy. They also had one major weakness that most species didn't know how to exploit. They weren't used to fighting humans. The Swift Current dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Theta 7 system, and immediately every sensor on the ship began screaming warnings. The mining colony was there, but it was surrounded by a cloud of Nexari bioships that looked like a swarm of metallic insects feeding on a corpse. "Dear gods," whispered their pilot, a professional freighter captain who had been pressed into military service for this mission. "There must be hundreds of them." Elena looked at the tactical display and felt that familiar cold calculation settle over her mind. "Not hundreds," she corrected quietly. "Exactly 437. 3 heavy cruisers, 12 destroyers, and the rest are fighter scouts and support vessels." Everyone turned to stare at her. "How can you possibly know that?" Rex asked. "I counted them," Elena said simply. "Nexari formations follow predictable patterns based on their hive structure. Once you know the pattern, you can calculate the total from a partial scan." The pilot was already working his communication equipment, trying to raise the colony or any surviving defense forces. Static filled the bridge until a weak signal finally broke through. "This is Colony Administrator Chen," a voice crackled over the speakers. "If anyone can hear this, we have maybe 200 survivors holed up in the deep mining tunnels. The Nexari have taken everything else. They're using some kind of biological conversion process on the surface installations. We can't hold out much longer." Elena was studying the sensor readings with the kind of focus she usually reserved for quantum mechanics problems. "They've got a standard harvesting operation going," she announced. 3 extraction points, overlapping patrol patterns, and a reserve force held back for emergencies. Textbook stuff, really. Textbook? Marcus stared at her. "You've studied Nexari tactics?" "Required reading at the Australian Enhanced Training Program," Elena replied absently. "Along with about 40 other hostile species. Never know what you might run into out here." Captain Morrison's voice came over the tactical communication channel. "All teams, this is command. We're detecting multiple Nexari patrol groups between you and the colony. Avoid contact and focus on civilian evacuation. Do not engage unless absolutely necessary." Elena looked around at her teammates, a medic, a technician, a heavy worlder, and herself. They were supposed to sneak past 400 Nexari ships, reach a colony under active assault, and evacuate 200 civilians without engaging the enemy. Right, she said quietly. Anyone else think this plan has some problems? Before anyone could answer, their ship's proximity alarms began wailing. On the tactical display, a cluster of red dots was moving toward them with the purposeful coordination that marked Nixari hunter-killer squadrons. Incoming, the pilot shouted. 6 Nixari scouts closing fast. They've definitely seen us. Elena was already unbuckling her acceleration harness. Can you get us to the surface? Not with those scouts on our tail, the pilot replied grimly. They'll tear us apart the moment we enter atmosphere. What if they weren't on our tail anymore? Everyone looked at her like she had suggested they try flapping their arms to achieve orbital velocity. Elena, Cora said gently, her tentacles conveying deep concern. Those are Nexari combat vessels. Our ship has minimal weapons and no armor. We can't fight them. Elena was already moving toward the ship's small equipment locker. Who said anything about fighting? She pulled out an emergency EVA suit, the kind designed for ship-to-ship transfers in hostile environments. It was basically a personal spacecraft, with life support, maneuvering thrusters, and just enough protection to keep a person alive in vacuum for a few hours. You can't be serious, Rex whispered. Elena was already climbing into the suit with practiced efficiency. Marcus, I need you to target their lead ship with everything we've got. Don't try to destroy it, just get their attention. Rex, can you create a false sensor signature that looks like we're carrying something valuable? Yes, but why would we want to attract more attention? Elena sealed her helmet and checked the suit's systems. Everything showed green. Because Nexari are predictable, they prioritize high-value targets and always investigate unusual situations. If you make us look important and dangerous, they'll focus everything on this ship. And what will you be doing? Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Elena moved toward the ship's small airlock. I'm going to take a little walk. The next few minutes were controlled chaos. Marcus opened fire with the swift current's pathetic defensive weapons, while Rex flooded the electromagnetic spectrum with signals that made their ship look like it was carrying experimental weapons or classified intelligence. The Nexari scouts reacted exactly as Elena had predicted. They abandoned their patrol pattern and converged on what appeared to be a priority target. Elena launched herself from the airlock while the enemy ships were focused on her teammates. The EVA suit's thrusters were designed for delicate maneuvering, not high-speed combat operations, but Elena had spent years learning to make equipment do things it wasn't designed for. She drifted silently through space, using the suit's minimal sensor package to track the Nexari formation. They were maintaining standard attack positions, which meant their rear guard was predictably positioned and completely focused on the swift current. Elena smiled inside her helmet. Sometimes being underestimated was a tactical advantage. The closest Nexari scout was a sleek biomechanical hybrid that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns. Its organic hull could probably shrug off plasma cannon fire, and its onboard AI was undoubtedly calculating the most efficient way to disable the swift current without destroying whatever valuable cargo it thought they were carrying. What it wasn't calculating was the possibility that someone would manually attach an improvised explosive device to its engine intake while it was distracted. Elena had learned to make bombs from whatever materials were available during her 3rd year at the enhanced training program. Australia's military philosophy was pretty simple. If you couldn't kill it with conventional weapons, you probably weren't being creative enough. The explosive charge was tiny, just some medical supplies and ship's chemicals combined in ways that would have made her chemistry instructors proud. But it was placed with surgical precision at exactly the right point to cause catastrophic engine failure. Elena was already moving toward the 2nd scout when the first one exploded in a brilliant flash of plasma and biological matter. The remaining Nexari ships immediately broke formation, their coordinated attack pattern dissolving into confusion as they tried to figure out what had happened. By the time they started looking for external threats, Elena had already disabled 2 more ships and was working on the 4th. The EVA suit's stealth capabilities were minimal, but in the chaos of exploding spacecraft and electronic countermeasures, She might as well have been invisible. The last two Nexari scouts finally figured out what was happening, but by then, it was too late. Elena's final improvised explosive device sent the fifth ship spinning into the sixth, and both vessels disappeared in a cascade of secondary explosions that lit up the local space like a small star. Elena activated her suit's emergency beacon and waited for pickup, floating peacefully among the debris of 6 enemy warships while her teammates stared at the tactical display in stunned silence. "Elena," Cora's voice crackled over the communication channel. "What exactly do they teach at that Australian program of yours?" Elena checked her suit's chronometer. The entire engagement had taken less than 12 minutes. "Mostly improvisation," she replied. "And creative problem solving, plus a lot of running." The Swift Currents pilot was already adjusting course for the colony, taking advantage of the gap Elena had created in the Nexari patrol network. "I've never seen anything like that," he murmured. 6 ships, single-handed, with nothing but an EVA suit and improvised explosives. Elena was picked up by the ship's recovery system and began climbing out of the EVA suit with the same casual efficiency she brought to everything else. "It's not that impressive," she said. "Back home we call that Tuesday." Marcus was staring at her with an expression somewhere between awe and terror. "What do you call actual combat?" Elena considered the question seriously while she stowed the EVA suit. "Usually, fun." The colony evacuation went smoothly after that. Word had apparently spread through the Nexari fleet that something unusual was happening, because they found the survivors without encountering any resistance. Administrator Chen was a tough woman in her 50s, who had managed to keep 200 colonists alive in mining tunnels, while biomechanical horrors converted the surface of her world into raw materials. "You're the cadets they sent to rescue us?" she asked, looking skeptically at Elena's small frame. "Among others," Elena replied. "How many people do you have who can't walk under their own power?" Chen consulted her datapad. 37 injured, 15 critically. We've got some mining equipment that could serve as stretchers, but the tunnels are pretty narrow. Elena was already calculating loads and distances. "Cora, what's your assessment of the critical cases? Can they survive a high-G evacuation?" "With proper support, yes," the Hetherian medic replied. "But it won't be comfortable." "Comfortable isn't really the goal right now," Elena said. "Marcus, I need you to scout the fastest route back to the surface. Rex, can you rig some kind of communication system so we can coordinate with other evacuation teams?" Over the next 6 hours, Elena's team managed to evacuate all 200 survivors, while avoiding Nexari patrols that were becoming increasingly agitated. The key was understanding that the enemy's hive-mind coordination was both a strength and a weakness. They were incredibly efficient at executing planned operations, but they adapted slowly to unexpected situations. Elena specialized in unexpected situations. By the time the Third Fleet arrived to clean up the remaining Nexari forces, Elena was sitting in the Swift Currents' small galley, sharing ration packs with the other cadets and listening to their increasingly animated recounting of the day's events. Since she just floated over to the Nexari ship like she was going for a leisurely spacewalk, Rex was saying, his 4 arms gesturing enthusiastically. "No weapons, no backup, just an EVA suit and what I can only describe as terrifying." "Competence." Elena looked up from her ration pack. "It really wasn't that complicated. Nexari ships have standard vulnerabilities and their tactical doctrine prioritizes efficiency over adaptability. Once you understand the pattern, the rest is just basic problem solving." Cora's tentacles conveyed amusement. "Elena, I think your definition of basic problem solving is somewhat different from the rest of ours." "Maybe," Elena admitted. "But that's probably because I grew up on Earth. When everything around you is trying to kill you, you get pretty good at thinking on your feet." Marcus nodded slowly. "That explains a lot, actually. I was wondering how you could be so calm about everything." "Calm?" Elena seemed genuinely surprised. "I'm not calm. I'm just focused. There's a difference." Rex leaned forward with obvious curiosity. "What's the difference?" Elena thought about it for a moment, trying to find words that would make sense to people who hadn't grown up dodging venomous spiders and carnivorous plants before they learned to read. Calm means you're not worried about anything, she finally said. Focused means you're worried about everything, but you're dealing with the problems in order of priority. Right now, for example, I'm worried about Nexari reinforcements, potential mechanical failures in our ship, the medical status of the evacuees, and whether we have enough rations to last until we reach the fleet. And you call that focused? Marcus asked. Elena shrugged. Back home we call that Thursday. When they finally reached the fleet rendezvous point, Elena found herself standing in Admiral Corvash's briefing room, surrounded by officers whose combined experience spanned centuries of galactic warfare. The Thraxian admiral's insectoid features were unreadable, but his body language suggested he was trying to process information that didn't fit his understanding of human capabilities. Cadet Vasquez. The admiral's voice buzzed with harmonic undertones. Your actions during the Theta-7 operation have raised several questions. Elena stood at attention with the same casual precision she brought to everything else. Yes, sir. According to the reports, you single-handedly disabled 6 Nexari combat vessels using improvised explosives and an EVA suit. Yes, sir. And you coordinated the evacuation of 200 civilians while avoiding detection by a superior enemy force. Yes, sir. Admiral Corvash's compound eyes studied her with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex puzzle. Cadet, these actions are consistent with someone who has extensive combat experience against Nexari forces, yet your files indicate this was your first actual engagement. Elena considered how to explain the Australian Enhanced Training Program to someone who had probably never seen a creature more dangerous than a houseplant. Sir, Earth's training programs are designed around the assumption that everything you encounter will be trying to kill you. The Nexari are actually less dangerous than some of the wildlife back home. The Admiral's antennae twitched in what Elena had learned was the Thraxian equivalent of a raised eyebrow. Less dangerous than wildlife? Well, the Nexari are predictable, Elena explained. They follow standard hive mind tactics, they have clearly defined objectives, and they operate according to logical parameters. A drop bear, on the other hand, will attack you for no reason at all, and they're nearly impossible to detect until it's too late. Drop bear? Carnivorous marsupial. About the size of a small shuttle, lives in trees, drops on unsuspecting prey. We used to have to run training exercises in drop bear territory just to teach situational awareness. The Admiral looked at his aide, a younger Thraxian whose antennae were practically vibrating with confusion. Make a note to review Earth's classification as a Class M planet. Elena cleared her throat politely. Sir, Earth is actually classified as a Class D death world, has been for about 50 years now. Dead silence filled the briefing room. A death world, the Admiral repeated slowly. Yes, sir. Hostile environment, dangerous native species, extreme weather patterns, that sort of thing. Most species need environmental suits just to visit safely. Admiral Corvash turned to his aide again. How exactly did we miss the fact that one of our cadets is from a death world? The aide consulted his datapad frantically. Sir, the human application listed Earth as their home world, but the documentation was filed under developing species rather than hostile environment adaptations. And nobody thought to cross-reference their planet's classification? Apparently not, sir. Elena watched this exchange with growing amusement. If it helps, sir, most humans don't consider Earth particularly dangerous. It's just home. The Admiral's compound eyes fixed on her again. Cadet, your planet has creatures that hunt for sport. Weather patterns that can kill unprepared individuals, and an ecosystem so hostile that it shaped your entire species into natural-born warriors. How is that not dangerous? Elena shrugged. I guess it's all about perspective. To us, Earth is just where we learn to survive. Everything else seems kind of easy by comparison. 2 weeks later, Elena found herself standing in front of the Academy's entire graduating class as Commander Thaxel read her commendation for valor. The words sounded impressive, something about exceptional courage and tactical innovation, but Elena was mostly thinking about the fact that her parents would probably want to frame the certificate next to her high school diploma. After the ceremony, she was approached by Captain Morrison, who had been unusually quiet throughout the formal proceedings. Vasquez, he said, falling into step beside her as she headed toward the exit. Got a minute? Sure, Captain. What's up? Morrison was quiet, for a moment, clearly choosing his words carefully. You know, I've been training military personnel for 30 years. Seen cadets from every species in the Alliance, worked with soldiers who were born for war. Elena nodded politely, wondering where this was going. But I've never seen anyone adapt to combat situations the way you do, Morrison continued. It's like you're running calculations that the rest of us can't even see. It's just pattern recognition, Elena said. Once you understand how systems work, you can predict how they'll fail. That's exactly what I'm talking about. Morrison stopped, walking and turned to face her. Most people see combat as chaos. You see it as a problem to be solved. Elena considered this. I guess that's fair, but isn't that how everyone thinks? Morrison laughed, a sound with very little humor in it. No, kid. That's how humans think. Specifically, that's how humans from death worlds think. The rest of us just try not to die. As Elena walked back to her quarters, she reflected on the events of the past few weeks. The other cadets no longer ignored her. In fact, some of them seemed almost afraid of her. Word had spread through the academy about what humans were capable of when properly motivated, and apparently the galaxy was still trying to figure out what to do with that information. She supposed it didn't really matter. Tomorrow she would graduate, and the day after that, she would receive her assignment to a real military unit. Whatever came next, she was confident she could handle it. After all, compared to surviving childhood in Australia, everything else was just easy mode. Elena smiled to herself as she opened her quarters door. Maybe now the galaxy would finally understand that when it came to humans, quiet didn't mean weak. It just meant they were paying attention. The end.